Take it off. Maureen Kleiss, president of our HOA board, jabbed her finger toward my daughter's chest like it was a trigger. Girls like her hide things. It's protocol. We were standing under the hot beams of the Glen Pavilion, the so-called Heart of Marrow Glen Estates, and every word she said landed like a slap against concrete. Rhea froze beside me, 14 years old, wearing her robotics club shirt, oversized only because that's how she liked them. Maureen tilted her chin. If she has nothing to hide, she shouldn't mind removing the shirt. I blinked once. That's not protocol, I said flatly. That clause was struck from the board's own minutes last year. Her smirk faltered. If you've ever lived in an HOA, and especially one like Marrow Glen, you know, when they're unchecked, they start inventing rules faster than you can challenge them. But this wasn't a petty notice about weeds or a mailbox being an inch off color. This was a grown woman demanding my daughter strip in public because of her gut feeling, and I wasn't going to let that slide. Subscribe if you believe rules should never be used to humiliate a child. Because this wasn't the last line Maureen crossed. I'm Callan Druitt. I moved to Marrow Glen 6 months ago, thinking it was safe. Clean sidewalks, security patrols, and a community park that looked like it belonged in a postcard. What they didn't advertise was Maureen Kleiss. She runs this HOA like it's her kingdom, and the board. Mostly scared, mostly silent. She didn't know my background. I investigate overreach, school districts, security departments, local municipalities. When they misuse authority, I'm the guy the state sends in to audit and burn it to the ground. But I don't talk about my job in community meetings. I came here to raise my daughter, not to fight another battle. Rhea had already been through enough. After her mother passed, she stopped speaking for almost a month. The robotics team gave her something to rebuild, tiny pieces she could control. That shirt Maureen pointed at? It had her first blueprint printed on it. Her design had won 3rd place at regionals. We framed the original. She wears the shirt when she needs courage, and now she was being told to take it off. I'm not hiding anything, Rhea whispered, her voice like cracked glass. That's not your call to make, Maureen snapped. The HOA reserves the right to inspect. No, I cut in. The HOA has no legal right to conduct searches of minors. You're on the wrong side of the law, in history. A few other parents had started circling by then, slow and unsure. Desmond Vare, board treasurer, stood by the edge of the pavilion, eyes darting between us. He didn't say a word. He never did. Maureen waved me off. If you don't like the rules, you know where the gate is. And that's when I realized something I hadn't let myself admit before. This wasn't just any violation. This was personal, not just for Rhea, but for every kid in this neighborhood who didn't fit Maureen's definition of acceptable. The single moms, the quiet dads, the girls who liked loose shirts and unbrushed hair, the boys who liked pink. This wasn't about rules, it was about control. And control is what I audit for a living. I looked Maureen dead in the eye and said, "This isn't over." She smiled again. "It never is, Callan." But this time, she'd picked the wrong father, and very soon, she was going to meet my sister, Detective Lieutenant Rihanna Thorne, State Civil Oversight Division. 2 days later, the park was quiet, but the silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt controlled. Rhea sat on the swing, legs tucked under her, hair shielding her face. She hadn't said more than a sentence since the incident at the pavilion. I stood off to the side, pretending to scroll my phone, but watching. Every few minutes, she'd glance toward the path that led to the HOA office, like she expected someone to appear. They always did. The more I watched this neighborhood, the more obvious it became. Maureen didn't operate by rules. She operated by patterns. And this wasn't the first time someone had been singled out. It started to click that afternoon during a routine walk around the park perimeter. 2 women I barely knew, Jenna Toll and Marta Ivers, were talking by the pet waste station. Their voices lowered when they noticed me, but not before I caught one of them say, "They made Kyle turn his hoodie inside out last week." Kyle was 11. I'd seen him before, quiet, gentle, always carrying that big sketch pad under his arm. The idea of him being stopped and searched because of a hoodie made my stomach turn. The HOA used vague language like community safety visibility guidelines. The terms were malleable, just enough to enforce on whoever they didn't like, and just flexible enough to avoid accountability. But they were doing it, and it wasn't just kids. Later that night, I knocked on the door of a neighbor I barely knew, Amir Halani, retired naval engineer. I'd seen him get fined twice, once for a decorative flag and once for equipment obstruction, which turned out to be a rolled yoga mat visible through his screened porch. We talked for 10 minutes. In that time, he told me about 3 other residents who had received repeated citations, all of them newer, younger, or, in some way, non-conforming to Maureen's unspoken standard. It was like she had a private filter she ran everyone through, too casual, too loud, too different. I'd seen this before. It wasn't always written into policy, but it was enforced as if it were gospel. I'd audited towns where playground rules were changed overnight to prevent lingering, all to drive out teenage skateboarders. I'd torn through school contracts that applied dress code enforcement 10 times more on girls than boys. This was the same blueprint, just wrapped in community newsletters and fake smiles. The next morning, Rhea came to breakfast in silence. Her robotic shirt was folded neatly on the table. "I don't want anyone to say anything again," she said without looking up. I felt something cold settle in my chest. This place, this perfectly manicured suburban utopia, was making my daughter shrink. That wasn't going to stand. I pulled out the notice we'd received the previous night, a written safety concern advisory citing Rhea's non-cooperation during an official HOA compliance inquiry. Maureen had stamped it herself in that big blocky signature of hers. I scanned the fine print. It wasn't a warning, it was a record. She was building a file on my kid. I flipped it over and saw a line that chilled me more than anything else. Multiple infractions may result in limited access to community resources, including park facilities and event participation. That was it. That was the play. They weren't just trying to shame Rhea, they were trying to isolate her. The HOA couldn't find a child, but they could make her invisible. Quietly banned from events, left off rosters, restricted from shared spaces, all without breaking a single formal law. That day I drove to the next town over and pulled parking in front of my office, a satellite cubicle inside the Public Safety Audits Division. I wasn't here to open a file. I couldn't, not with Rhea involved. But I could reread the rules. Maureen had cited Clause 14b in the original confrontation. I pulled up every reference to it. Clause 14b had originally referred to personal bags during outdoor events, checking for glass bottles or sharp items during fairs. It had never been about clothing, and it had been struck from the enforcement list over a year ago. Yet, here it was, used as justification for threatening a teenager in front of half the neighborhood. I leaned back slowly. This wasn't an interpretation error. This was targeted misuse of authority, and she'd been doing it to other families for years. And if that paper trail existed, someone on the board had helped bury it. The next HOA board meeting was scheduled for Tuesday evening at the Glen Pavilion. I didn't plan to speak. I just wanted to see who showed up, who kept their heads down, and who watched like they knew something. Maureen sat dead center behind the folding table, gavel already in hand. The moment she saw me walk in with Rhea, her jaw tightened just enough to register. She didn't acknowledge us. The room was packed tighter than usual. Folding chairs filled every corner, and still people stood along the back wall. I saw a few familiar faces. Amir nodded. Jenna from the dog park gave a half smile. But the most interesting person in that room wasn't speaking, waving, or avoiding eye contact. It was Desmond Vare. He sat third seat to Maureen's left, mid-40s, glasses, always in pressed sleeves and quiet. Shoes, HOA treasurer, never the one talking, always the one recording. While the others shuffled paper or leaned in to whisper, Desmond just sat with his notepad open and pen hovering. His eyes stayed on the residents, not Maureen. The agenda was laughable. Budget reallocations, landscaping bids, pool filter maintenance. And then, almost casually, Maureen cleared her throat. "Before we adjourn," she said, "I want to remind all residents of the importance of maintaining proper visibility standards for community safety. These include personal presentation, compliance with access verification, and cooperation with safety queries conducted by authorized volunteers." There were no rules being voted on, no discussion offered, just a blanket reminder that sounded official if you didn't know how these meetings were supposed to work. I raised my hand. Maureen stared at it like it was a fly on her plate. "Questions are closed for this session." I'm not asking a question, I said. I'm making a clarification. Someone shifted in their seat. I pulled the enforcement history for Clause 14b, I continued, and the board voted to sunset that language 12 months ago. It no longer holds authority. Maureen didn't blink. Our bylaw committee was never reconvened to revise it, I cut in. It was removed during the previous term. Desmond's pen stopped moving. Maureen gave a tight smile. Mr. Druitt, if you have complaints, you may submit them through the proper channel. She banged the gavel. Meeting adjourned. Chairs scraped as people stood. But Desmond stayed seated. For a long moment, his eyes didn't follow the crowd. They landed on me. He didn't speak, just nodded once. A slow, deliberate movement. I waited until most of the room cleared before approaching him. You've been on the board a long time, I said. 7 years, he replied without looking up. Long enough to remember when Clause 14b was actually about bottles at the summer fair? He finally looked at me, expression unreadable. I remember. And you remember who submitted the motion to strike it? His pause was answer enough. I can't open a state case myself, I said. But if I did, the first thing they'd ask for is board voting records, meeting minutes, especially if they'd been altered. He closed his notebook slowly. That's not something we talk about in the open. I don't need talk, I said. I need someone who remembers what the records used to say. Desmond stood. You have a daughter, he said quietly. Yes. My son's 10. The reason we moved here was because the neighborhood promised safety, routine, neutral ground. Feels more like a rigged game, I muttered. He didn't argue. Then he said something I didn't expect. You're not the first one she's tried this with, but you're the first who didn't back down. That told me everything I needed to know. It wasn't just about Clause 14b. It wasn't just about Rhea. There was a long list of people who had swallowed the injustice because they couldn't afford the blowback. Desmond was one of them, still was. But that look in his eye, resentment sharpened into memory, told me he was closer to tipping than he'd ever been. And if he tipped, so would the whole board. By Friday, it was clear Maureen had no intention of backing down. She didn't just double down, she escalated. The letter arrived in a white envelope, slid under our door sometime after dusk. No stamp, no signature, just the embossed HOA crest at the top. I unfolded it, expecting the usual soft threat language. What I got instead made my blood run cold. Effective immediately, Rhea Druitt is suspended from access to shared community spaces, including the park, pool, and all HOA-sponsored events, pending review of non-compliance behavior and perceived safety risk. There was no hearing, no conversation, just a decision made in silence and delivered like a sentence. They didn't even bother pretending this was about rules anymore. It was punishment, isolation. Rhea saw it on the kitchen counter the next morning. She didn't say a word, just picked it up, read it, and put it back down like it was trash. But her shoulders told me everything. The quiet retreat in her spine, the way she didn't finish her cereal. Maureen was testing me, seeing if I'd break, if I'd fold under the pressure like the others. But there was something she didn't understand. I've audited entire municipalities for discrimination policies. I know how power masks itself in paperwork. I know how people like Maureen think they're untouchable, not because they're right, but because they assume no one will push back hard enough, for long enough. They bank on fatigue. But I wasn't tired. I was getting sharper. That afternoon, I started logging everything. Dates, citations, printouts, direct quotes. If Maureen wanted to play official, I'd bury her in the real thing. And then something else happened. Around 4 p.m., I was outside, skimming the gutter leaves near the sidewalk when a car slowed down by our mailbox. I didn't recognize it, but the window lowered just enough for me to see the driver's face. Desmond. He didn't stop, didn't wave. Just slowed enough to make eye contact and then kept driving. 10 minutes later, I found an unmarked manila envelope propped against the front stoop. Inside were 3 sheets of paper. HOA meeting minutes. All 3 were from the prior year. All 3 referenced Clause 14b. But here's the thing. Each one showed different wording. In the April version, 14b was struck down in a unanimous vote. In the July version, it was listed as on hold pending review. In the September version, it was back, listed as approved, but without any record of a revote. There it was. Inconsistency. a procedural gap wide enough to walk a civil enforcement case through. I'd seen this exact tactic in my audits, changing language post-vote and pretending the edits were procedural, but that only works if no one compares records. Someone had preserved these originals. Desmond. He hadn't come out and said it, but this was a confession in paper form, and it meant he'd crossed a line, one that could cost him if Maureen found out. Which told me something else. She was losing her grip, and he knew it. By nightfall, Rhea had retreated into her room. I found her on the floor beside her desk, pieces of her robotics set spread around her like a shattered engine. Her shirt, the one Maureen had targeted, was balled up under her desk chair. I sat down next to her and didn't speak for a while. Eventually she asked, "Why do they care so much?" I didn't have a neat answer, so I gave her the truth. Because people like Maureen get scared when they can't control everything. She looked at me. "You're not scared of her." "I know how to beat her." Her eyes didn't move. "Then do it." I nodded once. "I will." I stepped outside and made a call I'd been holding back on. It rang twice before a sharp voice answered. "Thorne." "Rihanna," I said, "it's me." "You calling as a brother or as a citizen?" "Both." A pause, then, "Talk." I laid it out for her, the targeting, the clause manipulation, the suspension letter. Rihanna didn't interrupt, she just listened. That's her training. Let the details stack first, then attack. When I finished, she asked one question. "Is there a record trail?" "There is now," I said. "And I didn't build it alone." She whistled quietly through her teeth. "So, someone on the board flipped?" He didn't say it out loud, but yeah. She was quiet for another few seconds, then said, "I'll start internal prep. Civil oversight can't act without a formal handoff, but if this goes where I think it's going, she's in over her head." I hung up and stared out across the lawn. The Glen Pavilion was just visible beyond the trees, its rooftop sharp against the sky, like a blade waiting to drop. That night, I got to work. I didn't need to file a complaint as Rhea's father. I knew better than that. I filed it as a potential witness to policy irregularities involving vulnerable community members, language that triggers an internal risk review, especially when a minor is involved. Then I waited, but waiting didn't mean pausing. I started reviewing Maureen's previous newsletters. She had a habit of citing policy in vague terms, but one line stuck out. In last month's bulletin, she referenced the board's right to issue corrective action against pattern violators without external review. That was wrong. HOAs aren't legal bodies. They're administrative. They can't suspend rights to shared spaces unless explicitly authorized, and only after due process. That requires transparency. A vote. A hearing. Rhea had gotten none of that. The next morning, I paid a visit to Amir Halani again. His house sat near the end of the looped street, far enough from the HOA building to feel out of its shadow. He opened the door with a mug in hand, expression wary. "I need to ask you something," I said, "about the time they fined you for that yoga mat." His brow furrowed. "That was last year." "They wrote that up under a restricted equipment rule, right?" He nodded. "Do you still have the notice?" He disappeared for a moment, then came back with a printed letter, creased but readable. I scanned the header. Cited under Community Rule 11. Restricted Obstruction and Visual Compliance Standards. I pulled out my phone and opened a copy of the current Community Rulebook from the HOA website. Rule 11 was now titled Visual Interference and Resident Behavior Norms. No mention of equipment, no matching phrasing. They'd renamed the rule, quietly, retroactively. It was another data point. I left Amir's house with more than a copy. I left with a timeline. A pattern of quiet changes designed to tighten control without ever calling it what it was. And Maureen wasn't just enforcing rules, she was revising history to suit her whims. I brought the new evidence back home and started lining it up. Amir's citation versus the current rulebook, Rhea's advisory notice versus the original Clause 14b language, and 3 different sets of HOA minutes, all subtly different. One by one, I layered them into a clean audit report draft. This wasn't my job anymore, but it didn't need to be. I knew exactly what the State Enforcement Division required to launch a review, and I was giving them everything they'd need to take it from there. That night, Rhea finally spoke more than a sentence. She walked into the living room, holding her robotics shirt. Is it okay if I wear this again? I looked up from my laptop. You never had to ask. She pulled it on over her head and sat beside me. When you talk to Aunt Rihanna, are you scared? I thought about that for a second. Not scared, I said. Just careful, because people like Maureen don't back down when they're cornered. They double down, and then they crack. Rhea rested her head against my shoulder. I hope she cracks. She will, because now I had 3 things Maureen Kleiss couldn't erase: a paper trail, a witness, and a sister who enforced the law for a living. It happened the next afternoon. Rhea was walking home from school, earbuds in, same robotic shirt on. I was about 30 yards behind her, having parked by the trail that curved through the neighborhood greenbelt. I liked seeing her safe from a distance, giving her the illusion of independence while staying close enough in case anything happened. Something did. 2 HOA volunteers, Maureen's pets, appeared from behind the utility shed. Clyde Rosner and Betty Kell, retired, bored, and drunk on the tiny power their laminated community watch badges gave them. They didn't see me yet. Betty stepped into Rhea's path with a clipboard. "Excuse me, young lady, you're not permitted on this trail." Rhea took one earbud out, blinking. "I'm just walking home." "You're not authorized to use HOA trails during suspension," Clyde added. "Those are the rules." "No," I said, already striding toward them. "Those are Maureen's rules, not the HOA's." Both turned in sync. Betty squinted. "Mr. Druitt, this doesn't concern you." "She's my daughter," I said. "It concerns me more than either of you." Clyde tapped the laminated badge on his chest. "We're authorized by the board." "You're not law enforcement," I snapped. "You don't have authority to stop minors, and you damn sure don't have authority to interrogate them without a parent present." They hesitated. That's the thing about people who bluff. They freeze when someone calls it. "You touch her, you block her path. You so much as raise your voice again," I said, low and cold, "and you're going to be explaining yourselves to the state." Betty shifted uncomfortably. Clyde looked at Rhea like she was holding a weapon instead of a backpack. They backed off without a word. Rhea walked beside me the rest of the way. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. Her silence was sharper than any retort. When we got home, I didn't hesitate. I called Rihanna. "They just tried to enforce a ban that has no legal grounding," I said. 2 volunteers confronted her, middle of the public trail, no board motion, no vote, no law. "Did they threaten her?" "They blocked her path, questioned her. One of them reached for her backpack." Silence on the other end. Then, "That's enough." "What does that mean?" "I'm sending the intake packet for administrative freeze. Civil division needs 48 hours to finalize, but this gives me pretext to begin review. If the minutes are altered, and you said you have 3 versions, scanned and logged, then we got them." That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because I was worried, because I was ready. For weeks, Maureen had counted on my silence. She assumed I was just another father trying to avoid conflict, someone who'd move out quietly when the pressure got too loud. But I was doing what I always do, collecting, analyzing, observing, and now her pattern was exposed. The next morning, Rhea left for school wearing her robotics shirt with a denim jacket over it. Not to hide, just because she liked the look. She smiled at me before getting on the bus. It was the first smile I'd seen in days. I sat down at the kitchen table and opened my laptop. Desmond had sent another file, this time from a private account. It was the HOA's original internal memo on Clause 14B from the year it was written. And it wasn't just about bags. The last paragraph specifically stated, "Clothing shall not be subject to board inspection or interpretation. Enforcement is limited to visible, external objects in common areas." There it was. Her authority to enforce anything involving Rhea's shirt had never existed. Not in vote, not in practice, not in theory. I forwarded the memo to Rihanna. I didn't need to say anything. She'd know what it meant. Later that day, I drove to the county clerk's office to verify the HOA's original charter filings. Everything was still under the same name, Merrow Glen Estates Homeowners Association, Incorporated, but the digital timestamps showed edits on 3 separate dates with no matching meeting logs. Maureen had modified charter language without board-wide approval. That's not just unethical, it's illegal. I took pictures of everything. Now I didn't just have a pattern, I had a trail, a motive, and a timeline. She wasn't going to walk away from this. Sunday morning, a knock at my door. Not loud, not hurried, just deliberate. I opened it to find Desmond Vare standing on the porch, holding a brown folder tight against his chest like it was radioactive. He looked over his shoulder once before stepping in. "I don't have long," he said. "Maureen's got the rest of the board wrapped up in a special review session this afternoon. But if you're serious about this..." I closed the door behind him. He handed me the folder. Inside were 4 printed documents, originals, not PDF scans, not board-distributed summaries. These were pre-vote versions of proposed changes to multiple enforcement clauses, Clause 14B, Rule 11, and a new draft called the Behavioral Standards Proposal, each marked for review only, none signed. "She never put these to a vote," Desmond said. "She told us they passed, showed us final versions, but she skipped the process entirely." I scanned the dates. They lined up exactly with the fake minutes I'd found. Maureen had crafted the illusion of democracy, then enforced it like martial law. "What about the digital logs?" I asked. "She deletes old minutes, replaces them with her revised versions, then uploads them to the cloud folder. I saved these before she overwrote the drafts." I looked up. "Why now?" He hesitated, then, "Because she tried to do it to my son." I said nothing. "She told him he couldn't bring his therapy dog to the community event next month. Said the HOA didn't allow animals unless formally certified. The thing is, it is certified, and she knows it. She's seen the paperwork." That's when I understood. Desmond wasn't just nervous anymore. He was angry. The kind of anger that only builds when someone uses rules to humiliate your kid. "You realize what this means?" I said. "If you give me permission to submit these through the proper channel, the state will pull every piece of your board's activity into public review." He nodded. "Do it." I got up, opened my safe, and retrieved a digital thumb drive already set with the rest of the report. Minutes discrepancies, timestamp mismatches, enforcement letters, and now Desmond's files. I placed the documents next to it. "I'll scan these and upload them today. Once that happens, Rihanna's department can freeze board authority under state code. If she finds child targeting, it'll trigger a civil rights clause." Desmond exhaled like he'd been holding it in for a year. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Go ahead." "Why haven't you gone public already? You could have torn her down weeks ago." I leaned back in my chair. "Because I don't want to collapse," I said. "I want a record, something that doesn't just remove her, but prevents the next version of her from sliding in behind her chair." He nodded. "You're not just after Maureen. I'm after the structure that let her get this far." He left without another word. As soon as the door closed, I scanned the papers one by one. Then I encrypted the folder and sent it to Rihanna's secure channel. Within an hour, I got the reply. "Received. Beginning internal freeze draft." The next board meeting was in 2 days. That gave us just enough time. That evening, I stepped into Rhea's room. She was soldering something, circuit boards and wires arranged in a half circle on the floor. "Can I ask what it is?" I said. She didn't look up. "Motion-sensitive protest sign. Lights up when someone walks by." "What's it say?" "This is what control looks like." I stared at her for a beat. She was quiet, but she was learning, processing, fighting in her own way. "You're going to be dangerous when you're older," I said. She smiled. "I already am." Outside, the streetlights flickered on. Maureen's house sat 4 lots down, still, neat, silent. But I knew what she was doing. Meetings, scheming, trying to get ahead of a wave she didn't even realize had already hit. Because while she was busy weaponizing bylaws, I'd turned her entire paper trail into an indictment. And now, with Desmond's help, that trail had teeth. Monday morning, Rihanna called. Her voice was steady, clipped, her procedural tone, the one she used when things were about to turn formal. "We're issuing a pre-enforcement advisory today," she said. "Not public, not binding. But it puts them on radar. Civil Division will review your documentation for fraud, targeted harassment, and improper authority assumption." I sat at my kitchen table, coffee gone cold beside me. What happens next? If we move forward, the board's powers are suspended under Article 4B. That means no fines, no restrictions, no meetings without an external monitor. We can only do that if the Secretary of State approves emergency review. And if they stall, they won't, not with a child involved, especially not one with multiple. Records of documented targeting. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. What do you need from me? I need you to build a direct causality map, timeline, event to event. Every rule she bent, every time it hit Rhea, keep it factual. No language she can spin as emotional overreaction. That I could do in my sleep. I spent the next 4 hours doing exactly that. It wasn't just what Maureen had done. It was the order, the intent, the escalation. First the verbal confrontation, then the citation, then the fabricated safety concern document, then the path-blocking incident. Each step built on the last, moving from manipulation to coercion. By noon, I had it mapped, labeled, and time-stamped. At the center, I placed the original clause 14B memo Desmond had handed me. That was the anchor, the proof that Maureen had acted without authority from the start, and used that falsified rule to justify everything that followed. When I finished, I slid the timeline across 2 large corkboards and photographed the entire layout. Then I converted it to a PDF and uploaded it to the encrypted folder Rihanna had set up. At 2:14 p.m., she replied with a single word: perfect. Now it was about control, of the narrative, of the pace, of the final move. That night, I sat down with Rhea and explained what would happen next. She listened quietly, eyes fixed on my laptop screen, where the timeline glowed in soft blue. So they'll shut her down? She asked. If the board meets tomorrow like they're planning to, they won't be able to take any action, I said. Civil enforcement will be watching. And if Maureen tries to push anything through, they'll freeze the session in real time. Rhea didn't say anything for a moment. Then she asked, "Do I have to go?" "No," I said gently. "You don't owe them anything." She nodded. "Okay." She didn't smile, but I saw something shift in her posture, a loosening, a release. That evening, I walked through the neighborhood slowly, taking mental inventory, flags perfectly spaced, hedges trimmed to regulation height, trash cans nowhere in sight. It all looked pristine, but it was rotting underneath. I passed the community bulletin board, once plastered with HOA rules and event flyers. Someone had pinned a blank white sheet of paper in the center, nothing written on it, just tacked there, silent and defiant. A placeholder, a dare. I smiled. Back home, I printed 3 sets of the full documentation: timeline, rule comparisons, original drafts, Desmond's minutes. One would go to Rihanna's office as backup, one would remain sealed in my home safe, and the third, that one was for tomorrow's meeting. At exactly 7:45 p.m., just before the board would call the room to order, I'd walk in with the folder tucked under my arm. Not as a protester, not as a father, as a witness, a professional, a man who knew exactly how far Maureen had stretched her power and how to snap it back in her face. Because once that meeting began, everything she'd built on fear and silence would be held to account. Not with shouting, not with threats, with evidence and law. The Glen Pavilion was already half full when I arrived. The folding chairs were arranged in their usual rows, tight and tidy. Maureen liked order, her version of it anyway. She stood near the front, flanked by her usual allies, Clyde Rosner and Elaine Tanis, both pretending not to see me. I didn't make a show of it. I just walked in, placed the manila folder on the edge of the community comment table, and took my seat near the back. Desmond arrived 5 minutes later. No nod, no glance. Just a quiet confirmation that he was here and ready. At exactly 7:45 p.m., Maureen tapped the gavel once. "This meeting will now come to order." Her voice was steady, even pleasant. To anyone new in the neighborhood, she probably sounded like a competent, civic-minded organizer, the type who volunteered at bake sales and donated old books. But I knew better now. That voice had been used to silence residents, distort procedure, and single out families who didn't fit her mold. "We have a short agenda tonight," she continued. "Primarily updates on our community standards policy. We'll be voting on a clarification amendment concerning visible concealment garments and safety flag procedures." I leaned forward. She wasn't backing down. Even with the advisory warning in place, even with state oversight looming, she was going to try and ram one more false rule through before it all crumbled. And she was doing it in public, with smiles and phrasing that made it sound like common sense. Elaine passed out copies of the proposed amendment, 2 paragraphs, vague enough to mean anything. Desmond sat motionless. His fingers tapped his notebook just once. I stood. "Point of order," I said. Maureen didn't look surprised. She didn't even blink. "We are not currently in the community comment section, Mr. Druitt." "This isn't a comment," I said. "This is a procedural objection." The room went still. Several heads turned. "I'm submitting a formal motion to halt this vote based on improper procedure and existing advisory notice from the State Civil Oversight Division." A flicker passed behind her eyes, fast as a blink. "There is no official notice at this time," she said smoothly. "Only a preliminary advisory. This vote is internal policy, not external enforcement." "That's not how this works," I replied, my voice calm. "If a vote results in suspension of member access or contributes to enforcement action, it falls under civil scrutiny, especially when minors are involved." Someone near the front murmured. Clyde glanced at Maureen. Elaine's fingers tightened on her copy of the amendment. Desmond cleared his throat. "I'd like to see the advisory." I walked up the aisle, retrieved the folder from the table, and handed a copy of the printed advisory email to the board. "Dated today," I said. "Received at 4:17 p.m. Language includes recommendation to suspend policy updates until state review concludes. You can ignore it, sure, but that becomes your liability." Maureen didn't touch the paper. She stared at it like it was radioactive. "I recommend we postpone this vote," Desmond said, his voice steady. "Pending legal clarification." Elaine looked at Maureen. "Maybe we should—" "No," Maureen snapped. "This is our jurisdiction. We're not going to be bullied by vague threats and overreactions." I turned to the room. "My name is Callan Druitt. I work for the Office of Public Safety Audits. I've spent the last 3 weeks documenting an escalating pattern of rule manipulation, unauthorized enforcement, and administrative fraud within this board. I have meeting minutes that contradict public records. I have policies that were never voted on. And I have children, including my own, who've been targeted by procedures this board had no authority to enforce." Gasps. A few people turned to each other, whispering. Desmond stood. "I move that we table all voting matters until we complete an internal review." Elaine hesitated, then nodded. "Seconded." Maureen's hand hovered near the gavel. She looked around and saw it, what she'd feared. The shift. The moment when silence broke. She didn't bring the gavel down. She walked out instead, left her chair, her papers, her vote, and strode straight out of the pavilion without a word. The room didn't erupt. It didn't cheer. It just sat in silence, watching the end of something that had ruled them quietly for far too long. Maureen's chair remained empty for the rest of the night. No one dared to sit in it. Not even Elaine, who, after a moment of stunned stillness, folded the proposed amendment and tucked it back into her binder like it had never existed. Desmond quietly gathered the advisory notice and stood, murmuring something to the board secretary as he exited. No vote was taken, no further discussion held. The meeting collapsed without a single word of closure. By the time I stepped outside, most of the residents were already dispersing, muttering low and fast as they headed for their cars. Only one voice rose above the rest, Mrs. Porter, from the corner lot, asking anyone who would listen. "So, does this mean the fines are void now?" They weren't, not yet, but the fear that upheld them had cracked. Back home, I found Rhea asleep on the couch with the lights still on. Her robotics gear was spread across the coffee table in half-completed shapes, wires curling like vines. She must have fallen asleep waiting to hear what happened. I didn't wake her. I just sat nearby and listened to the quiet. It didn't feel like a win, not yet. Maureen was gone from the room, but she wasn't gone from the game. People like her rarely quit clean. They retreat, regroup, then reappear with a new title or proxy. The next morning proved my point. At exactly 9:03 a.m., every mailbox in the neighborhood received a folded half-page flyer. No envelope, no HOA branding, just black ink on thin paper, and the words, "When outsiders want to rewrite the rules of your home, who's really protecting the community?" No signature, but I didn't need one. It reeked of Maureen's tactics, half-truths dressed up as concern, laced with paranoia. A message not to me, but to the board members she was losing. By noon, I had already received 2 emails, one from a resident asking if I was part of some activist group, and another, unsigned, telling me to take your kid and go. Desmond messaged me too. Short, clipped. She's still trying to control the board through back channels. More coming. Hold tight. I did more than hold tight. I uploaded every document again, this time to the state's permanent archive submission portal. It wasn't optional anymore. Rihanna's department was officially greenlit to open a full oversight investigation, and that meant everything went on the record. 2 hours later, I received a confirmation email from the Civil Oversight Division. Board activity temporarily suspended, pending legal review. Enforcement, powers frozen. Board members notified via certified delivery. It was done. The shield had dropped. The HOA board could no longer issue violations, process fines, enforce suspensions, or conduct meetings without a state monitor present. Until further notice, the neighborhood was in administrative limbo, and for the first time in years, free from Maureen's grip. Around 4, I walked out to the bulletin board at the center of the neighborhood. A few residents were already gathered around it. Someone had posted a printout of the freeze order. Others had scribbled questions on sticky notes. Does this mean the parking citations are erased? Who's in charge now? Can we meet without her? I watched them read. I watched them process. And then I added something of my own. A copy of Clause 14b, the original with the paragraph that stated in plain black ink, "Clothing shall not be subject to board inspection or interpretation." I pinned it beneath the freeze order where everyone could see it. No one spoke, but a few people nodded. That evening, Rhea stood beside me at the kitchen counter, watching me make tea. She still hadn't asked how the meeting ended. "You know," I said, "they froze the board today." She didn't blink. Like, shut it down? For now, they're under review. No more fake rules. No more notes slid under doors. She reached across the counter and picked up a marker. On the back of an old receipt, she scribbled something quickly and handed it to me. "We are not property. We are people." "Put that on the board," she said. I smiled. "I will." The next board meeting wasn't called by Maureen. It was called by the residents. Under the interim freeze, any community gathering had to be public, transparent, and non-binding, meaning it couldn't enforce or undo policies, but it could finally open space for real voices. Desmond organized it. Officially, it was listed as a community listening session. Unofficially, it was the reckoning Marrow Glen had avoided for years. I arrived 10 minutes early with Rhea by my side. She wore her robotics shirt again. No jacket this time, no hesitation. The Glen Pavilion was already half full, but the tone was different now. No rows of nervous silence. No stern board at the front table. Just folding chairs in a circle, residents talking in small knots, some holding papers, others with arms crossed like shields they weren't quite ready to drop. Desmond stood near the center, a portable speaker clipped to the back of a folding chair. He gave me a nod when we entered. He didn't need to say anything. We both knew why we were here. When the session began, Desmond kept it simple. "This is a resident forum. No votes, no enforcement. Just accountability and information. Anyone who wants to speak will be heard." The first to stand was Marta Oivers. She clutched a crumpled notice in her hand. Her 4th citation over lawn decor, she said. But what made her voice crack was what followed. I changed it every time, followed every rule, and still, I got fined again. Next was Amir Halani. He brought his yoga mat, held it up like evidence in a courtroom. "This was the obstruction," he said. Apparently that's what counted. More followed. One by one, the quiet residents spoke about being told their flags were too large, their cars too old, their children too loud. And over, the same pattern emerged. Enforcement wasn't about rules. It was about control. Then Desmond stepped forward and laid it out. He didn't mince words. He held up the original board minutes, the unedited drafts, the illegally altered clause. He showed the timeline I'd built and the advisory notice from the state. "This is what was done behind closed doors," he said, voice calm but iron tight. "These changes were not voted on. These restrictions were never legal, and some of us sat silent for too long." He looked at me. "Callan, would you speak?" I nodded, stood, and walked to the center. "I moved here to give my daughter safety," I said. What I found was something that looked like safety on the surface, but punished difference the moment it appeared. I pulled out the original 14b memo. This was the rule used to target my daughter. It was never authorized, never approved, but it was weaponized just the same, and it wasn't just her. I stepped back. You've all lived under it. There were no cheers, no applause, just silence. And silence was louder. Then the final voice spoke. From the back of the room, Maureen Kleiss stood. I hadn't seen her enter. She walked slowly to the center of the circle, her usual polished composure stripped down. No gavel, no binder, just her and the weight of the room. "I did what I believed kept this place safe," she said. No apology, just justification. "I took initiative when others didn't. Some of you saw that as strength, others, clearly, as something else." The air turned sharp, a few murmurs. One man stood and left. "But let me make one thing clear," Maureen continued. "I'm not ashamed of order. I'm ashamed you think it doesn't cost something to preserve it." She turned to walk out again, but this time Desmond stopped her. "You forged official documents," he said, voice even. "The state will decide what that costs." Maureen didn't respond. She didn't have to. She was no longer in control. When she left the pavilion, no one followed. The circle closed. Residents stayed. More stories were told. More questions asked. It wasn't a clean resolution. It wasn't a movie ending. But it was real. The first time truth had ever spoken louder than rules in this place. And that, for now, was enough. 2 days later, Rihanna arrived in person. She didn't call ahead. She didn't need to. When her government sedan turned onto Marrow Glen's main loop, blinds shifted in half the houses. People stepped onto porches. Conversations went quiet. For the first time since I'd moved here, the entire neighborhood felt like it was holding one breath, waiting for whatever came next. Rihanna wore her full civil oversight uniform, dark slate jacket, badge visible, hair pulled back with the precision of someone who lived inside rules but never abused them. She walked toward the Glen Pavilion with a folder tucked under her arm. Not a thick folder, a decisive one. I followed behind her, Rhea at my side. Desmond was already there, speaking with 3 residents who looked both nervous and relieved. They stepped aside when they saw Rihanna. Inside the pavilion, the folding chairs still sat in the same circle from the listening session. Nothing had been moved. It felt appropriate, like a room still shaped by truth. Half the board was present, though avoiding eye contact. The other half hadn't shown up at all. Maureen wasn't there. Rihanna didn't ask where she was. "This will proceed with or without her," she said, as she took the center position of the circle. She opened the folder and spoke in a voice trained to carry without shouting. "Effective immediately, the Civil Oversight Division is enacting a full administrative intervention into the governance of Marrow Glen Estates. Findings include improper authority assumption, procedural fraud, targeted harassment, and unauthorized enforcement against minors." A ripple went through the room. Shock, vindication, relief. Rihanna continued. "All enforcement powers of the current board are suspended. All pending violations, suspensions, and fines issued under altered or unauthorized clauses are null. A temporary operations officer will be appointed to stabilize governance until new elections can be held under state supervision." Someone whispered, "Oh my God." Another whispered, "Finally." But it wasn't the freeze or the nullifications that hit hardest. It was what she said next. "The state is also opening an inquiry into the former board president, Maureen Kleiss. For document tampering and civil rights violations involving a minor, she will be contacted separately." Desmond exhaled sharply. Amir covered his mouth. And Rhea just stood a little taller. After she finished reading, Rihanna handed the signed order to Desmond. He held it like it weighed more than paper. "This is yours to steward now," she said. "Make something better of it." She turned to me as the room began to buzz with hushed conversation. "You built a solid case," she said quietly. "Most people never know how to document abuse until it's too late. Your daughter's lucky." I glanced at Rhea. "I'm the lucky one." Rihanna nodded once, then excused herself to brief the residents gathering outside. I stayed inside with Rhea as the room slowly emptied, people stopping to thank us, to apologize, to share their own small pieces of the story. Not out of obligation, out of relief, out of recognition. Eventually, it was just the 2 of us in the pavilion. The late afternoon light streamed through the open slats of the roof, catching the dust in the air. The same place where Maureen had once stood and demanded my daughter remove her shirt now felt different. Open, freed. Rhea walked to the bulletin board. The papers from the listening session had been taken down, but the pinholes remained like tiny scars. She took out the handwritten note she'd made days earlier. "We are not property. We are people," and pinned it right in the center. She stepped back, crossed her arms, and nodded. "That's better," she said. "Yeah," I replied. "It is." Outside, the neighborhood felt different too. Not perfect, not healed, but awake. Rhea slipped her hand into mine as we stepped out of the pavilion. "You still think we should have moved here?" she asked. I thought about it, about the fear, the anger, the fight. And then I thought about the circle of chairs, the stories told, the people standing a little straighter, a little less afraid. "Yeah," I said, "because now it's ours." If you've followed this story all the way to the end, thank you. These battles happen quietly in neighborhoods everywhere, and voices matter more than rules. Subscribe and don't miss the next story. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments what injustice you want tackled next.